Hello, I'm David Hunt, CEO and founder of Hyperion Executive Search and the host for the Leaders in Cleantech podcast. Welcome back to the show. Had a great week last week in Munich at Intersolar that was disturbed slightly on the way back by some flight chaos, and I know some friends who were getting the train back from Munich also had some issues. And it's timely perhaps we talk about transport, efficient, clean transport with our guest today, who is Keith Bradbury, who is the CEO and co-founder of Ember. Keith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Timely introduction.
Cool. So yeah, there's so much to talk about with what's going on at Ember. Obviously, a recent fundraise which we can touch on. Some phenomenal growth in the usage of your solution. So and lots to dig into. Let's perhaps start with just a little bit of an overview. So just very quickly, Keith, what or who are Ember?
So Ember are the UK's only intercity transport provider that's utilising a fully electric fleet, but more than that, we're really a company that's focused on, I guess, rebuilding transport and intercity transport in particular, and just making that really good. And that means both the software, the online experience, but also offline, the actual onboard experience and the experience you get as a passenger.
Cool. I think there's so many things there. Of course, we touch on the clean transportation and the fact that all the buses are electric and how that sort of functions and works and how the solution is end to end. But I was actually having a conversation, again, given the flight chaos recently, and talking to people about how, people's perceptions of transport and people's perceptions of public transport and buses in particular often is negative because of, well, partly because it's been quite shoddy, I guess, in many ways, to get sort of good public transport and reliability. And you're obviously bucking that trend and doing it in a clean and sustainable way. But actually, part of the solution is just making the customer get where they want to go when they want to go there. And it seems you've started with that, and kind of the sustainability and the electric vehicle angle, I guess, is not as much a byproduct, because I know that's part of the theme, but it's not necessarily the core theme. It's about transportation, getting people to have good, reliable services to get where they want to get to when they want to get there.
Yeah. So I guess what I lean into with all of this stuff is thinking about myself as a passenger. And I've been on bus and coach on every continent that buses and coaches exist. And doing that, you see lots of different experiences. You see, in some places in Asia, you might not have a digital experience. It might be that you go and you buy a ticket, and then you go and you hope that your bus turns up. There's no tracking, but you get on and it works. And that's shuttling around, millions of people every day. But I think what I want, as someone who is a tech enthusiast, who's a mobility enthusiast, who's kind of, I guess, zero emission enthusiast, is that I see this massive opportunity to be able to move people more efficiently, use our existing road infrastructure more efficiently, and give them an experience that is better than their car. And I think that's the key challenge. And as you kind of highlighted yourself, people don't want to use the bus in preference to their car, but that's not because of some fundamental issue with a bus or a coach. In reality, that experience can be much better than your car. But you have to be really focused on that experience, understanding what that means, and then how you deliver that to passengers. And if you take all of that and then you bolt on the fact that we are zero emission from our core, we only started because there was this opportunity to use electrification as the catalyst really for a new business model. The way of actually, that adds to making us more efficient by reducing the cost of our fuel. That means that we can run more services, for example. More services means we're getting more people to where they want to go. And that's how that adds in. We're not trying to say that, you should do this and it will save the planet, and as a result, it's going to cost you more. It's the opposite to that, actually.
Right. Yeah. Which I think is fundamentally important that people just get, and that's often the case with electrification of transport in all of its guises. It's just better, and that's, I guess, the key thing. Loads to go further into there, Keith, but perhaps again you can start with a little bit of your backstory and the genesis of Ember in terms of how you came to, so obviously relatively young guy, to co-found the organization. So tell us a little bit about how you got to that point.
Yeah, so Piers, my co-founder, and I, we worked together at a Fintech company in London for several years before this, and kind of went on a really great scaling journey there, had a great time, but ultimately decided we wanted to do our own thing. And our own thing there, we were looking for something where we could be focused on the climate. We view climate as, I guess, if we're going to spend the next 20 years working, let's put it into something that we really view as a very long-term trend. And the real genesis actually came from a bus journey. It all started, a coach journey that Pierce was on in Africa. And then he was in Namibia. He was on this coach and he looked at the odometer. It was reading several million kilometers. And during this 24-hour trip, they kept stopping to fill up with diesel. And he was thinking, okay, well, we're stopping each time. It's costing us X in diesel. Then he looked at the odometer. Then he did the maths and he sent me a message and he said, this coach is spending roughly this much over his lifetime on diesel. If you did this with electric, you would stand to save, multiple millions of pounds. And that is kind of really interesting, I guess, wedge that you start thinking about the business. And because then you start thinking, well, what does it take to do that? And so that for us was the starting point. We started there and he said, well, can you buy an electric coach? And it turns out that was exactly the time you could buy an electric coach. We bought the first ones in the UK.
Okay.
And the technology had just got to the point where it could support something like that. So it was a very kind of first principles exploration into what would it take to build a business like this. And then we started realizing that all the pieces were coming together within the market and the wider market and supply chain that would support it. And so we decided, let's get on with it and do it. And I guess that was the point we started really talking to a lot of suppliers, third parties, and said, this is what we're thinking of doing. Will it work?
Yeah.
And obviously everyone just said, no, you definitely can't do that with electric vehicles. But actually, now 4 years later, we're pretty confident we can do it.
Yeah, and you're proving the point. Again, it's not something the first time I've seen that, but it's how a tech company is solving a problem that a traditional logistics or transportation company would fail to do or fail to innovate in the way that you have. And it's interesting. I think you refer to yourself as a tech company, which clearly is, and we'll dig a bit further into the tech behind the service in a moment. But I guess not having those, going back to those people who say, no, it's impossible, not having those, I guess, embedded ideas and the ability and indeed the sort of the entrepreneurship. So actually, if a lot of people are saying no, then there's got to be a yes somewhere that nobody else has thought of.
I think with a lot of this stuff, there's a lot of legacy thinking, not just in this industry. We saw it in Fintech before this. There was a lot of legacy thinking with the banks as well. Why doesn't a bank like Barclays or HSBC have a decent log-on process for businesses? You compare that to Revolut or Monzo or one of the new kind of neobanks, and it just works. And it's not because it's impossible to do. It's just all of this legacy that kind of holds people back. And I think when you're fresh into an industry, we came into this industry with a blank sheet of paper. We skilled up, we learned as much as we could about the industry, but ultimately we're trying to solve things from the perspective of being passengers, but also being technologists.
Okay, let's look at the end-to-end process. Let's start with in terms of the hardware, the actual vehicles and the batteries, the EV charging side of things. We'll move on to the customer experience and the software side too. But firstly, tell us a bit about the vehicles and the sort of the charging infrastructure and how you're managing to. I mean, obviously you're on a relatively small number of routes at the moment, but the ambition again we'll come back to is enormous. But tell us a little bit about just the actual hardware that you sit on.
Yeah, the hardware. It's great having this hardware side of the business because obviously a lot of kind of tech businesses don't have a hardware element, and you're kind of focused on the software and the product and making sure that you get the product market fit nailed. And for us, we have this really big hardware element. And obviously, if you want to run electric vehicles, you need the vehicle. Now, for the vehicle, the first ones that we were buying off the shelf from a Chinese supplier called Yutong, who are the biggest bus and coach manufacturer in the world. But to run those vehicles, you also need the chargers. And that was kind of a learning journey that we've been on. Because ultimately, what's, I guess, unique about our business model is this high utilization. So each vehicle is doing nearly 1,000 kilometers a day. And to do that, you need to be driving, then charging, then driving, then charging multiple times per day. But to do that is when you get into the detail of, okay, well, you need a water-cooled battery. Okay, what kind of cooling system do you need? What is the optimal temperature for a battery to be at? And then from there, you go on the hardware side, you go back to your charger. So why does your charger not have 100% reliability? Oh, that's because this has a voltage fluctuation of 5 millivolts, but really it should be 2 millivolts. And all of that side of the business on that hardware, I guess, is something that we've really been learning a lot about. We don't want to build our own buses. We don't want to build our own chargers. What we do want to do is use the best technology out there to deliver the passenger experience and get people, where they want to go. So where we've ended up is now our coaches are they're fully electric. They're always been fully electric. They are what you would think of as a kind of traditional coach. They look, it's a 14-meter long vehicle, 53 seats. And, you go on board. I think you probably think that it's a bit better than most of your coaches in that you have a little bit of extra leg room. The seats are very high quality. There's 5G Wi-Fi. All of those things that you kind of see as a passenger are kind of adding into the experience.
Yeah. And there's a lot of, as you say, learning there. You're coming from a fintech company. Is there a sort of touching on sort of your university experience or beyond, is there a sort of an engineering or a nerdy tech side in there as well as the sort of the fintech software side of things?
I think so. I think Pierce and I are both just hyper curious and kind of product engineering style people. And so we look at all of this stuff with kind of this deep curiosity of wanting to understand what is really possible. And I think when you do that, you start to unlock what the technology can really do. And that's why I say that when we said to people, we want to drive 1,000 kilometers a day, people said, you just can't do that. And then it's kind of, well, why? Why can't you do that? And then they give you a reason and they say, oh, because your charging curves won't work because the battery will overheat. And it's like, well, okay, well, why is that? How does heat dissipation from a battery work? What are the different coolants that you can use? And you can kind of get into all of this detail. And it's a bit of a rabbit hole sometimes, actually. But that's where you then also need to be able to think at that micro level and then zoom right back out and say, hey, me as a passenger, what is important to me? It's about getting to where I want to go. And so as a business, what Ember is trying to deliver on is take all the learnings about batteries and charging and use that to deliver a service that's just much more reliable. We want to be well more reliable than a diesel coach, for example. And I know this actually from looking at other operators, they're breaking down far more than us. And that's because one, I think the technology is just better, but also our understanding of the technology and how we can see a problem manifesting itself before it's a problem means that we have less downtime. And it's that less downtime that a passenger really appreciates. It's not that they care that the motor temperature is 30 degrees versus 35 degrees. They care that, the service said it was going to be there and it was there every day. Every day of the year, it's the same.
Jump back to, obviously, we had the chance to meet in Prague at the Innovation Capital event, and one of the things that struck me then was about this utilization, because again, that's one of the troubles with the business model, is trying to make sure you got a sufficient utilization of the vehicle in this instance. But you're able to do that with high utilization and also actually provide, from what you were saying, a comparable, if not better, cost price for customers. So actually getting a better service on a cleaner vehicle for a comparable or cheaper price.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a great innovation. If you think from first principles about what does electrification provide to you, it gives you a more expensive vehicle to start with. But the running costs are so much lower because your fuel as your input is that much lower. And I guess that's the kind of the thing that we think about is how do you optimize your fuel costs? Well, one way of doing that is having on-site generation. We have these 2 wind turbines on one of our main sites, and that provides electricity directly to our vehicles. That's great from an emissions perspective and thinking about the environment, but it's also great from a commercial perspective. And that's how you then reduce your operating costs. It's roughly 3 to 5 times lower when you're operating these high mileage vehicles. And I think that is where it's not just that you can pass on a lower price to customers, it's that you can run more services. We can run 24/7. We run through the night. It means that, we can tell people legitimately, you will never miss your bus home because there is always another bus. Even if you miss the one that you plan to get at midnight, well, there's one at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. And I think that is the thing that gives people a lot of confidence to use you, because then they're happy to come into town to travel in with you because they know they can get home with you. And that's not the case for trains. I've had it personally, as a passenger, I always come back to this. I've slept in train stations before when I've missed a train home at midnight.
Yeah, likewise.
I was a long distance train and I was young and I had no other way of getting home. And so I slept in a train station. But I think those are the things you solve for.
Yeah. I'm old enough to remember when the tube used to shut down and be stuck on a tube chase, and more nights than I care to mention way back when. So let's talk about the customer experience then. So we've got this electric vehicle. We've got obviously the infrastructure to support that. You've got high utilization because you're running obviously long periods of time and you're attracting customers. We'll touch on the customers a little bit in terms of perceptions and how you've built up quite quickly. But tell us a little bit about the sort of the platform. So if I want to catch a bus on one of your routes, how does that go about, and what does the software, the payment, all this kind of stuff that supports the services and solutions overall?
So I guess just like I mentioned before, that electrification or electric vehicles were the kind of catalyst in many ways for our business to move forward. Technology and what technology has enabled in many industries is also a catalyst. And that's how we think about, rebuilding the model. And so when we were thinking about what is Ember and kind of what sits at the core of it, it's really the software stack. And so what we've got is Ember OS, which is kind of our name for this like internal platform, which manages absolutely everything in the business. And so by everything, what I mean is it manages the vehicles, it manages the chargers, do things like control the charging speeds, but it also manages the customer experience. It manages the driver experience. So it's connected directly to an iPad that all of the drivers are using. It manages or it supports the management of the network through the operations team. It does things like timetabling. It does things like scheduling. And all of that is contained within our own system. And by kind of building that full stack, and that is a lot to take on, I can appreciate that. But it's the thing that kind of unlocks all of the benefits across the business. So I guess maybe I can give kind of one example of how that manifests itself, in that all of the telematics data and running data from the vehicle comes into our system in real time. And so when a vehicle is driving, let's say I gave this example of motor temperatures. Let's say the motor temperature ticks up slightly and it goes above what we have deemed a critical threshold that maintenance would need to look at it. The system is then alerting a maintenance person back at base to say, hey, this vehicle has just jumped up. That's a bit unusual. It could be this or this. You could do with taking a look at it. The system then looks forward and says, well, what is that vehicle being used for later in the day? It then can reallocate the vehicles. It can substitute one for another. It can notify the driver who is on those later shifts to say, actually, the vehicle you need to be taking out is now this other vehicle. And it's also in the background checking, well, how many passengers are there on the later trip? How many bikes are booked on? Are all the facilities on board the same as the vehicle was substituting in and out? So that we're not going to suddenly get there and find we can't carry passengers because it's either a different size or there's less storage or, all of those types of issues. And all of that is just happening in the background. And it doesn't require any human intervention. It doesn't require any manual operation. And that comes from the fact that it's fully integrated. And I think that's very difficult to do unless you build your own system. If you're trying to pull together lots of different systems, you will inevitably just run into a piece of functionality that it doesn't support. And then it's difficult to convince, a software provider that, oh, we really need this specific feature, please build it.
So how long did it take you, Keith, to get from, not quite from Pierce's trip in Namibia, but from founding the business to the point where you are now, where you've got fully functioning, proven routes already, and obviously looking to the future, which again, we'll touch on in a moment. But how long was it to get to the point where you are now?
So I guess we started talking about this in 2019. 2019, we started making inquiries to vehicle suppliers. We started kind of getting into the nitty gritty of what it would take to run a transport company. When we made those first inquiries, actually, we were doing from personal email addresses. We didn't even have a company name. So we then came up with a company name kind of mid-2019. We got serious about ordering some vehicles. There's roughly a 6-month lead time to get a vehicle, and that extended slightly because of COVID. And so we ordered the vehicles 2019, and we were due to launch the business on March the 1st, 2020. And if you can remember back to January, February 2020, we saw a problem coming because we were getting updates from the factory in China saying, oh, there's something going on here, we're behind on production schedules. And anyway, the rest is kind of now history. But it meant that we delayed the launch of our business to October the 1st, 2020. And on that day, we did launch. And since then, maybe what we launched with was 2 vehicles on a single route. And in many ways, that was for us to prove that the spreadsheet, we had a spreadsheet, I guess, at that point, but it was to prove that the spreadsheet really worked and that we could do what we said we would do, and that our basic kind of Ember OS that we had at that time could also manage the vehicles, and then it could do some basic kind of driver and customer management. And so since then, we've run services every single day. So 365 days a year. Since then, we've been running services and we've been scaling up our services. We've been adding routes, we've been adding vehicles, and we've been building more of our own charging infrastructure. And so today, we've got roughly 20,000 passengers a week. We've got 38 vehicles. And that is really the kind of the beginning of the next phase of growth. So I guess we can talk a bit about what that means going forward. But certainly what we've been able to prove is like the fundamentals of the business work now. We know that there are things like the unit economics work. We've proven that the technology, the hardware, all of this hardware that we talked about, that can do the things we said it can do. We took a bit of a gamble on that, but actually it has all worked and we've got all of the data, and now I can explain in great detail why it does work. And I think on that point, there are things like, I still see in the car press, things like, oh, an electric car will never go beyond 100,000 kilometers. And in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, well, actually, our oldest vehicles now are getting up towards 1 million kilometers. And I know in great detail how healthy those batteries are.
Right.
So I personally don't have any issues.
Yeah.
But you need to be in the detail of understanding this stuff to get the confidence to scale it up.
I think that's one of the challenges that you've done remarkably well. I want to touch on, I guess it was sidelined slightly by that thought or the comment you just made, because I was getting a taxi back from the airport, my sort of reconfirmed flight, in the Tesla Model S, and the taxi driver was over 200,000 miles in his S, and obviously had no problems, which to EV drivers like me and many of our audience, we just know that's how it is. But the perception in the public is significantly different. Again, they're just looking at, there's going to be a Tesla showroom not far from where I live, and in the local press, there's all these comments online saying, "Oh, fires, this, that, and the other," and all the usual BS that's perpetuated by the media. But you've launched something which, again, in the public, there must have been some skepticism, not just with the public, and you've now got 20,000 customers or passengers, but also in terms of actually convincing, I guess, which you had to do, people to let you run these buses on those services and all the insurance and those kinds of things. So how did you, I guess, take the leap to choose the routes? How did you get authorization for the routes? And how did you start to then promote the service to get to where you are now?
Yeah, so getting started, was difficult, because I guess the first thing you need to do when you're talking about buying these expensive assets is get finance for them. And so at the beginning, there was this kind of hesitation. And obviously, we'd come from lending. I had spent nearly 10 years doing that. And so I knew something about business lending. And there was a lot of skepticism for the reasons you just highlighted. It was, partially misinformation, partially misunderstandings. But eventually, we found a great debt partner in Triodos Bank. They kind of really took some time to understand the business, understand what we were trying to achieve, and they could see how it could be really impactful. And so that was the thing that I guess really unlocked us being able to start the business. And then from there, things like, how did we choose the first route? Well, going back to the days before we even had Ember email addresses, we reached out to lots of different councils, and we kind of said to them, we would really like to run this service. Can you help us get a charger? And I guess, when you're really bootstrapped, you're trying to find a way just to get it done with not too much money. And it took a single individual at Dundee Council who really pushed it forward, who took it on and said, I can see the value of this to the population of Dundee, to the people, and I think I can help you make it happen. And he did. And that was, I guess, what I would consider an outstanding response relative to many of the other people that we tried to contact who never replied, or who said no, they couldn't do something. And that's what allowed us to actually start the business. And from there, we've kind of grown. It's not just things like job creation. We've hired, I guess, 100-ish people now in Dundee. But it's the fact that was, again, the catalyst which allows us to scale the network, because that single charger proved that these vehicles can do it. We've made lots and lots of improvements since then. And actually, the nice thing about the UK is that it is a deregulated market. So you're asking about routes. Running from Dundee to Edinburgh, as we did on our first route, will be the same process to run from Bristol to London, or if we want to run from Liverpool to London, or Liverpool to Leeds, somewhere like that. All of those things that kind of follow exactly the same process that we've been on. However, we're now starting from a different position. When we talk about going and launching a new charging hub, we're going and developing our own piece of land. We're not reliant on the council anymore. Instead, we will do the search, we will find the land, we get power quotations, we install our own charging hardware, we develop the site, we allocate buses to it, we hire drivers, and then you've got a live site with running routes on it.
So that's I said, it's always great that there's somewhere a catalyst or an individual hero, as it turns out, that sort of helps move the business move forward. How about then reaching out to start to populate those routes once you had the sort of the ability to do so? What was the sort of customer perception, and how did you reach out to the market?
Yeah, the key bit there was when we had the ability to do so. 2 weeks after launching, we went back into lockdown again. So things were relatively difficult for us in the early days. But we took that as an opportunity to learn operationally. And we did run services all day, every day, despite there being very few passengers. You know, we were providing transport for doctors and nurses and kind of those key workers who were traveling around. But when it came kind of time that we could actually start, I guess, marketing, a lot of it came from word of mouth, actually. And so coming back to having these assets, having this big, 14-meter long branded billboard effectively driving around every day past your house, you start to see it and you think, well, what is that? And people would look us up and they would find us and they would travel with us. And what genuinely happened is that, and we found this out through kind of customer research, someone would travel with us and then they would go and tell a bunch of other people that they know who live around them, because typically your kind of social group are the people you live around, and lots of one of the smaller towns that we're serving. And then they say, I had this amazing experience. It was so much better than I expected. And it was low cost and great value for money. And all of a sudden we start seeing many more people coming in. And this was most pronounced when we started adding new stops along existing routes. And we, one funny anecdote actually, we added this new stop that didn't have a direct link to either Dundee or Edinburgh on our first route. And I asked one of the guys in the team to go and do some flyering in this kind of it's a relatively small village, less than 10,000 people. And he went there a week after we added this stop into our network. And when he got there, he tried giving out flyers and people said, oh, no, you're from Ember. No, we know you. Yeah, we've used you. We've all heard about you. So we don't need the flyers. I'm like, oh, okay. And I think it's it's kind of a super interesting industry because people do want to talk about it. People do want to have this positive experience of, oh, my bus turned up exactly when it said it was going to turn up, and they got me to where it said it would. And that spreads very, very quickly. So I think that's kind of been our main growth channel, to be honest.
Okay, cool. And just going back to that, so in terms of the customer interaction, knowing when the buses arrived, this like tracking of when the next vehicle is, that's all done via an app?
So that's all done via our website, actually. So we have kind of push notifications to customers so they can see, when it's coming, they can see if there is a delay. And that's what gives them kind of the confidence, is that real-time communication. If there's any changes to their trip, for example, if we need to move a bus stop because, there's been like a road closure and we have to move a bus stop, we can immediately push that information to a passenger and they can go to an alternative stop. Historically, that would have just meant someone missing their bus. And that's when people get really frustrated. And then, smaller things like, because we've got all of the real-time tracking of the vehicles, we know where every vehicle is at all of the time. If we're 30 minutes late on any trip, we will give what we call a zero-click refund. So literally as the bus gets you to your destination, and we also know that it was 30 minutes or more late, which is very rare, by the way. But when we drop you off, we will instantly issue you a refund. You don't need to email. You don't need to click something in an email. You don't need to do anything. You just get a notification to say you've been refunded. And we get a lot of response to that email that goes out because people are like, oh, wow, I didn't expect that. Or some people actually have emailed back to say, oh, you don't need to do that. It wasn't your fault that you were late. It was a road closure or there was an accident. And that's how you really build loyalty, like long-term loyalty, is kind of doing stuff like that, which it has a cost to the business, but as far as I'm concerned, is tiny relative to just encouraging people to use your service and grow the market through then word of mouth.
Yeah. No, I love that. I've always had a long-term view on business that we don't take, from Hyperion's perspective and my previous solar business, we didn't take shortcuts or take advantage of anybody, and we suffered a consequence in the short term, but in the long term, it only ever proved to be successful.
And I think that's very, very core to Pearsonize what you've just described, which is being long-termist. It's taking that long-term view and remaining directionally correct on that, and that knowing that you want to get there. I think no startup, unless you're in a I guess, a very unique situation. Most startups and founders need to be willing to accept they're going on at least a 10-year journey. And if you commit to that 10-year journey, and then you remain directionally true to that 10-year journey in all of your decision making, I think you end up in a very, very strong position. And sometimes that doesn't come after 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years. Sometimes that takes 8 or 9 years when suddenly you look back and you think, okay, we're in actually a great place because we've been kind of constantly going in a directionally correct kind of angle. So that kind of long-termism is really important to us.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. Again, I was reading something, I'm trying to think of off the top of my head the author, but I was reading something about, again, there's too much in startup land, not just in Cleantech, but generally in startup land, that you found the business with an exit in mind, and you obviously, the journey is to be the glorious IPO if you're lucky, or at least, some sort of exit in 3 or 4 years. But the reality is, like you say, to get real traction in the business, it takes 10 years. Our period is 10 years old next month, by the way. So I think we're doing okay.
Congratulations.
But it does take that period of time. And also it actually takes for the founders, like you say, to be committed to that this is, this is not a 2-year situation. This is something we're going to put our heart and soul into. And if we think in the long term, then we're much more likely to actually get to that end point than we are if we think in the short term.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's why we've gone into so much detail on so many different parts of the business. And sometimes that means not panicking where we have things. I'm not kind of suggesting that everything in our business is totally perfect. They're definitely not. There's lots of things that can be improved or fixed. And sometimes you need to kind of understand that you can't fix everything at once. And so where we have known pain points, and actually, if I look back going 3.5 years, I would say our passenger experience 3.5 years ago was rubbish compared to where it is today. But I'm hopeful that in another 3.5 years, I'll also look back at today and say, wow, that was rubbish, because we moved on. And I think that's just about understanding what you can do, how you can deliver it, and what's realistic. So it's kind of that combination between long-termism and kind of practicality, I guess.
Yeah, and that view of continual improvement. Again, everybody talks about that kind of stuff, but actually to fundamentally look at how every day you can improve the business 1% at a time, or 1 fraction of a percent at a time, but on an ongoing basis. That's where you get to exactly those situations when you can look back and say, actually, 5 years ago we were rubbish, but 5 years ago we thought we were great because we were better than everybody else at the time. But it's that journey, isn't it, that again is focused on always the customer experience and making it better and more efficient. Whatever the business is, it's better and more efficient and always evolving.
Yeah, and I think there we also talk in tandem with long-termism is about, if you're going to build a solution, especially within the tech team, if you're going to build something, you should be confident that you can leave that feature and it will run for 5 to 10 years without breaking, and it should be mostly future-proofed. Now, it won't catch everything, but it forces some discipline in kind of not taking sloppy shortcuts, because that is how you end up with a huge amount of tech debt. And I've seen that happen across multiple companies, I guess, in my career, where half of the tech team is just working on tech debt. And I think if you're a bit more disciplined, and that can be quite frustrating sometimes because it means you don't go as fast as you could go, but it's kind of directionally correct again for this long-term progress and for putting you in a really strong position long-term.
Cool. Well, let's look at the long term, because again, you came a little bit to prominence, and Petra Inven introduced us when you had obviously a recent raise, which was a decent raise for a young company. So let's look at the future. What does that look like? What's the sort of the first stage of the raise to facilitate? What's the longer term ambition, and what do we see in the next year or two?
So on kind of ambition, when Pierce and I kind of started Ember, we were very, very clear about where we wanted to end up, and that was with a large company, multi-geography, and with a super high quality public transport network. And we've kind of been going on that journey, and we've been kind of proving out the different elements of it. And, the first one was to get ourselves onto a kind of VC growth style business. And so we raised a seed round in 2022, and that was, I guess, the first step. And the next step kind of along that journey was convincing the next step of investors, or the next, I guess, tier of investors, to then come in and join and also put us on that continued trajectory. And that's where Inven, 2150 and Anu joined our Series A earlier this year. And they're joining now because we have proven out the basics and the fundamentals of the business. They can see the potential. Now it's really on us to deliver that potential, which means scaling the network. It means building more charging hubs, getting more vehicles. It means being operationally beyond excellent, actually. It's kind of operationally next level. It's the way that I think about logistics businesses like, Amazon or Ocado, or, these businesses that have had this real focus on efficiency, but in a hardware sense as well. And for us, that's scaling up the business across. First is the UK. So we want to get the network running. We see no reason that we can't be connecting every town and city in the UK. There's basically no routes that we think are suitable for kind of coaches that couldn't be run with electric vehicles. And by that, I mean, we're typically targeting routes of under 4 hours. Now, I know there is a bus, for example, that goes from Edinburgh to London, but I actually don't think that that is the best form of transport for a trip like that. I think if you're going to do that, I don't want to sit on a coach for 12 hours. I can take a train. The train is 4 hours. That to me is a kind of more efficient use in a way, or efficient way of traveling. So I'm not trying to convince someone, hey, sit on a coach for 12 hours. It's the shorter journeys, the kind of 30 minutes to 4 hour journeys where I'm saying you can travel by coach. There is minimal, if any, time penalty compared to your car, and you can get your time back. You can do it at a lower cost than the car, and we can get you from where you are to where you want to be. And that's what we're kind of focused on building over the next few years.
Right. Look forward to seeing more of that roll out from your own perspective, and from, as I said, some of us that in the company that are looking for ways always to get ourselves about and not always having to jump in the car. So that's the shorter term plan is to have really good coverage of the UK. By the way, from what you were saying before, you must be one of the largest fleets of electric buses outside of China already. I would have thought from the numbers you've talked about.
We're definitely the largest with electric coaches. Electric buses, there are some large inner city fleets in Europe, but those are kind of being run on really short routes. They might be doing 100 miles a day. We're kind of much more focused on how does a vehicle do 500, 600 plus miles a day. So it ends up just being very different, both in terms of the vehicle itself, but also in terms of that and the operation and what's required of it.
Okay. And then beyond, I'd imagine, again, I spend most of my time, or a lot of our clients are in continental Europe, and it's fair to say that nobody is impressed, maybe in Switzerland, but certainly not in Germany, with public transport. So there's a great market beyond the UK for you as well.
I think so. I guess my really core belief on this stuff is that, as I said at the beginning, I've traveled on bus and coach on every continent. In all of those different places, you've got people who are moving, you've got roads, and you do have electricity in most of them. I remember being in Nepal, actually, traveling on coaches there, and the electricity would be more challenging there because they have rolling blackouts in Kathmandu, so they distribute the power. But that, to me, is also a problem that will be getting solved. We don't need to solve the grid problems in Kathmandu, but we can go there once those problems are solved and launch intercity, or we can launch kind of medium distance electric bus and coach services. Now, I know that there is demand there for it. And it's the business model, the kind of the real fundamentals of the business model only require those things. Our platform, in many ways, is already ready for internationalization. So that can be transplanted and plugged in. It's a bit like Uber scaling up their cities. They just took core platform, spread it around. And I guess that's how we think about it. And we see many opportunities, not just Europe, but also beyond Europe. There's many, many opportunities where we might have even bigger advantages, actually. So if you take somewhere like Nepal or even Morocco, or places that don't have great train infrastructure, people are already traveling by road. They're traveling by coach. They know the coach market and they know the bus market, but they don't necessarily have the best experience. And you can kind of level that experience up, both on the digital side. Everyone everywhere now has, a phone, has a smartphone. And so that's how, in many places where they skipped payments, where they skipped cash, if you took a look at Kenya and how they did with skipping on the payment network, actually, they skipped generations of technology. We can do that on the transport side as well.
Yeah.
So I think we could go many, many places, actually, but it's more about, for us to think about, how do we ensure we deliver this great experience where we go, and not dilute that experience so that we end up in potentially more countries, but with a slightly worse experience, because I think that is not directionally true to what we want to do as a company.
just a thought in some of those countries you mentioned that co-located storage and batteries could be a great solution for you and others as well. Let's talk about, Keith, again about your journey. Now, you and Keith have obviously known each other for quite some time. I've had the opportunity to meet you both. There's a good dynamic there as a founding team. How important has, I guess, that been to you? And given that you started when you did, and we won't go into all the COVID stuff, but we all know that was an absolute, not quite sure how you term it, an absolute disaster in so many ways that confused so many people, and there was a lot of fear factors. But you've been resilient enough to keep going and keep not just surviving, but actually using the time to your benefit. But so again, just perhaps talk a bit about some of the resilience and the advantages or disadvantage of having a sort of a founding team. Because I've always found that clearly being a CEO or entrepreneur of any nature is a very lonely place, and having a really good relationship with somebody that supports you, I've certainly found personally and seen around is really, really helpful. But perhaps just tell us a little bit about the sort of the founder story from that perspective, and also just around any lessons that you might share from the resilience that you had to show during those challenges in the early years.
So Pierce and I obviously worked together at iWalker before this, and we had several years there together where we worked very closely together. We had kind of a big part of the business between us. And in a way, we kind of had like a mini founder relationship. And so, we would use each other as sounding boards for lots of different ideas that were maybe outside of my domain or his domain. We would come to each other. And I think that was a kind of a really core thing to understand. We knew each other as people, and we knew how each other think, how we approach things, what stresses us out, for example. And I think that was a very solid foundation to go into a new business. But I think that, to me, has been one of the key things. You talk about resiliency. I think sort of having a co-founder, I definitely could not have done this journey on my own, actually. I would be really honest and say that. And I wouldn't have been a solo founder, actually. I don't think it's something that I could have done. And so having someone that is completely on your level, someone that you trust, and someone that you kind of can reciprocate on every level with, I think has been hugely important. And, when you're banging your head against a brick wall, or when you're getting the, 100th rejection email from investors, the other person, is not losing faith in you. They're just saying I know you're nailing this, but it's just not working. And so maybe we should try something different, or, whatever it may be at that time. And I think that has been key to our growth, actually. And we spend a huge amount of time with each other, both at work, but out of work. And in your introduction, actually, you kind of introduced me as CEO, and actually we're co-CEOs.
Right, okay.
And that is, that's a really, really important one for us, that we both want to remain in that role, but as co-CEO. One of us is not really gunning for that role, and the other one is not gunning for like a CTO or something. In many ways, we want to remain at this level where we can be deep generalists. And that's kind of how we think about ourselves, as both as deep generalists, and that we can help other people be great in their roles. But I think for us, we want to be great in this role. And in many ways, I think we want to be great in this role as a team, not as individuals. But I would say it's kind of a relatively unique kind of founder relationship that we've got relative to a lot of other founders that I meet.
Yeah, no, it certainly sounds that way, but it's great that it's got you through the trials and tribulations to the point you are now with obviously a big future ahead. We've kind of a little bit run out of time. It's been great to talk to you. Could talk for hours more, but I think it's really great to show and share innovation, and again, that blend of hardware and software, which is one of the things I quite enjoy, where companies are utilizing both, because we all know that software is brilliant, but we also need to build on physical stuff, whether it's solar or batteries or vehicles. So it's great to hear the journey that you've been on and the support that you've got. So we'll point to people, Keith, in terms of so they can find out some more, looking at obviously the website and other places where they can catch up and see what you're doing and see a bit more about how the vehicles look, all this kind of stuff. And hopefully we and they will see some Ember buses somewhere near them in the not too distant future.
It is definitely coming. So look out for us.
Thanks, Keith.
Thanks very much.